At noon on April 18, 1942, 16 B-25 Mitchell medium bombers suddenly appeared over mainland Japan. They destroyed targets in Tokyo, Yokohama, and Nagoya, hitting over 10 military and industrial sites. This was a retaliatory strike by U.S. forces against Japan for the Pearl Harbor attack, historically known as the Doolittle Raid. This meticulously planned and boldly executed air raid was backed by America's formidable industrial strength. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States produced over 400 million tons of steel for the war effort, which was 5 times more than the Soviet Union, 7 times that of Britain, and 12 times Japan's output. Over 1/3 of this was produced by U.S. Steel, headquartered in Pittsburgh. American steel was forged into helmets, bombs, aircraft carriers, and tanks, supporting U.S. forces from Midway all the way to Tokyo. This steel industry leader, based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, along with companies like Boeing and the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, forged an era of American imperial dominance. However, no one could have predicted that 80 years later, this steel mill, bearing the glory and memories of their fathers, would face acquisition by a Japanese company. In December 2023, Nippon Steel, Japan's largest steel producer, announced its intention to acquire U.S. Steel for $14.1 billion, pending regulatory and shareholder approval. Although the deal faced opposition from both Trump and Harris's campaign teams, political intervention couldn't halt the decline of the American steel industry. Back in the 1950s, Nippon Steel's predecessor, Yahata Steel, was a recipient of technical assistance from U.S. Steel. But after the U.S. shifted from an industrial to a financial economy in the 1980s, the American steel industry entered an irreversible decline, with current production even falling below 1970s levels. Despite politicians from both parties championing manufacturing reshoring, their so-called America First ultimately proved to be election-focused political theater. Under the logic of vote supremacy, what's being lost isn't just this former steel giant, but also America's global dominance. In 1945, U.S. steel production reached 66 million tons, accounting for over 60% of global output. U.S. Steel, headquartered in Pittsburgh, was the undisputed industry leader. In 1953, U.S. Steel's annual production peaked at 35 million tons, employing over 340,000 workers with the world's most advanced steelmaking technology. One company's steel output equaled that of all countries combined outside the United States. This was the miracle that U.S. Steel had once created. During the same period, Japan's steel industry faced a life-or-death crisis. To crush Japan's war potential, Five-star General MacArthur ordered the breakup of 325 major Japanese corporations. Mitsui Trading was to be split into over 200 companies. Mitsubishi Corporation was divided into 139 companies. In the steel industry, Japan Steel, which had supplied military needs during World War II, and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries faced dissolution. After the war, Japan's annual steel production plummeted to 560,000 tons, less than 1/10 of its wartime level. At this rate, Japan's steel industry would never recover. However, a report brought a turning point for Japan's steel industry. In February 1950, the U.S. Munitions Board approved a proposal called Japan as a supply source for U.S. military requirements, designating Japan as America's primary military supply source in Asia to provide weapons, vehicles, and logistical support. 4 months later, the Korean War broke out. With the U.S. Munitions Board's tacit approval, Japan's military-industrial, steel, and other industries began operating at full capacity to meet American military demands. The famous Toyota Motor Company was then just a truck factory and on the verge of bankruptcy. But then, an order for 1,000 U.S. military trucks fell from the sky, allowing Toyota to recover to pre-war production levels by 1951. Ultimately, 297 of Japan's 325 major corporations avoided breakup. Although Japan Steel was split into Yawata Steel and Fuji Steel, it retained its previous scale and production capacity. During the Korean War, the U.S. Munitions Board purchased $1 billion worth of war assets from Japan, with indirect amounts reaching $3.6 billion. This injected momentum into Japan's post-war economic recovery. Under the special procurement economy's favor, all war-related Japanese industries received snowflake-like orders. At this point, Americans hadn't anticipated at all. They were nurturing a beast that would soon devour them. On March 21, 1957, Nobusuke Kishi, Shinzo Abe's grandfather and a class of war criminal, became Japan's prime minister. During his tenure, the United States and Japan accelerated their cooperation. In 1960, the US and Japan signed the US-Japan Security Treaty in Washington, and its accompanying technical transfer agreement provided Japan with American technological assistance. As a result, Japan's Yahata Steel sent over 100 engineers to study at US Steel. These engineers brought back oxygen, converters, continuous casting technology, and heat treatment processes, then world-leading techniques. In 1970, Yahata Steel and Fuji Steel merged in Japan, forming Nippon Steel, and that year's crude steel output surpassed US Steel's, making it the world's largest producer. Although Japan's steel industry was thriving, at that time, America's steel industry remained powerful through historical momentum. In 1973, US annual steel production peaked historically at 136 million tons, with over 600,000 workers enjoying the world's best wages. That same year, the $750 million World Trade Center Twin Towers were completed using over 200,000 tons of structural steel. The 110-story structure used a steel frame tube design, standing like a steel giant. That symbolized American steel industry's glory. However, no one could have predicted this would be the American steel industry's final echo. Soon, Japan's steel industry would not only surpass America's in output and efficiency, but would also devour the very steel companies that had served America so valiantly during World War II. On January 7, 1982, US Steel acquired Marathon Oil for $10 billion, bringing oil operations into its business scope. Regarding this acquisition, Pennsylvania Senator Arlen Specter, who had previously provided tax benefits to US Steel, let out a sigh. He stated, "We should still focus our business on the steel industry, but the problem is, the American steel industry isn't profitable anymore." In 1982, 4 American steel giants, including US Steel, LTV, Armco, Bethlehem, and others, the total net revenue was negative $2.99 billion. In contrast, Japan's steel production surpassed the United States in the 1980s, becoming the world's largest producer. The European Union and Australia's steel production also began catching up, with global steel output surging from 190 million tons in 1951 to 720 million tons in 1980, more than tripling. U.S. steel production once exceeded 100 million tons, but then declined annually and stabilized at around 80 million tons. This occurred because capital is mobile, and it automatically flows to industries with higher returns. Meanwhile, America's steel industry had lost its competitiveness, facing challenges from emerging producers. Of course, this wasn't just a problem for the steel industry, as all of America's basic manufacturing sectors faced similar issues. American industrial workers had simply become too expensive. Therefore, U.S. Steel's shareholders invested their capital in more profitable sectors, unwilling to continue investing in steel production. From 1973 to 2000, U.S. Steel barely implemented any new technological upgrades. Instead, to reduce steel production costs, they continuously dismantled steel furnaces and laid off steel workers. And the number of American steelworkers plummeted from over 600,000 at its peak to just 150,000 by 2000. And by 2000, all of U.S. Steel's profits came from its energy division, while steel manufacturers that couldn't compete went bankrupt. In just the 3 years from 1998 to 2001, over half of American steel companies filed for bankruptcy protection, including America's second-largest steel company, Bethlehem Steel, and its third-largest producer, LTV Steel. America's steel capacity remained at 80 million tons mainly because these steelworkers still held significant voting power. U.S. steel production was highly concentrated in traditional industrial regions like Pennsylvania and West Virginia, where steel industry employees and their families wielded substantial political influence. Their votes carried considerable weight. American steel companies secured high tariff protections through lobbying and received substantial subsidies from the federal government. In 2001, when President George W. Bush had just moved into the White House, a particularly troublesome document appeared on his desk. It was a proposal jointly submitted by U.S. Steel and numerous smaller steel companies. One provision demanded that the U.S. government provide $12 billion to cover steelworkers' pensions, and while American steel tariffs were already high, the document requested that Bush further raise import tariffs. U.S. Steel's document arrived at an opportune moment, because during the 2002 midterm elections, Pennsylvania's 6 House seats would determine whether Republicans maintained their majority. So on March 5, 2002, George W. Bush announced a 30% tariff on most imported steel. The Bush administration's strong support initially excited America's steel industry, with U.S. Steel even spinning off its non-steel businesses. After refocusing on its core steel operations, U.S. Steel implemented various reforms, but it was too late. By then, a steel giant had already risen in the East, not only claiming the top global production spot at an incredible pace, but also surpassing the combined output of all other nations. America's steel industry became like a patient on life support, surviving only through federal subsidies and tariff protections. This anti-market behavior naturally faced market consequences. On September 4, 2024, Pittsburgh's U.S. Steel Tower gathered many U.S. steelworkers. They came to support Nippon Steel's acquisition of U.S. Steel, protesting the U.S. government's repeated obstruction of the deal. For a simple reason: after the acquisition, their wages and benefits would improve. Nippon Steel had promised that if the deal succeeded, they wouldn't lay off workers, close factories, or move production overseas, but would invest more and relocate the U.S. headquarters from Houston to Pittsburgh. However, just 2 days earlier, Harris had publicly opposed the deal at a Pittsburgh rally, citing manufacturing protection and American job preservation. Clearly, a deep disconnect had formed between political rhetoric and economic reality. The separation was complete. Politically, neither Harris nor Trump would approve this acquisition, as it would represent a major failure in protecting American industry and another symbol of manufacturing decline. Moreover, U.S. Steel is located in Pennsylvania, one of the swing states, and neither party wants to lose political points. In a way, protecting manufacturing has become America's new political correctness that both parties compete over, vying for who can make America great again. Though in reality, many U.S. steelworkers support the merger. However, in media coverage, they were portrayed as a group fighting to protect jobs and preserve American companies. Nippon Steel hadn't anticipated that America would be so anti-market economy. To facilitate this deal, Nippon Steel had already invested substantial resources. On December 18, 2023, Nippon Steel offered $55 per share, significantly higher than U.S. Steel's stock price of $48.65. After reaching the agreement, U.S. Steel CEO Burritt immediately issued a statement, saying this acquisition benefits America by ensuring domestic steel competitiveness while strengthening our global influence. U.S. Steel's best days are ahead. 2 weeks later, Trump stated during a Washington interview that he would immediately block the acquisition if he were president and bring jobs back to America. Trump used this acquisition as a perfect case to attack the Biden administration. Consequently, on March 14, Biden explicitly joined the opposition. He stated in his declaration that U.S. Steel is an iconic American company, and maintaining its American-owned status is crucial. with bipartisan opposition. The acquisition, originally scheduled for April 2024, faced repeated delays. Japan failed to understand the signals from both candidates, thinking their sincerity was insufficient. On July 23, Nippon Steel announced its withdrawal from the 20-year joint venture with WWII Steel, reducing its Chinese steel capacity by 70%. Japan hoped this would demonstrate their alliance commitment to America. But it turned out, America wouldn't treat Japanese capital as their own. The so-called borderless capital was merely an illusion during prosperous times. Even though Japan is America's ally, was no exception. On August 31st, the U.S. Committee on Foreign Investment wrote to Nippon and U.S. Steel, stating the acquisition posed serious national security risks that could reduce U.S. steel production and harm supply for critical projects. Nippon Steel responded with a lengthy letter, promising an additional $2.7 billion, still fantasizing about supplying America. However, at such a critical time so close to the election, this highly politicized acquisition deal was doomed to fail, and the so-called revival of American manufacturing was merely a slogan both parties used to compete for voters. When it came to the fundamental issue of worker shortages, neither party's candidates could propose effective solutions. The number of workers in the American steel industry had been declining steadily since 1973, and today the entire United States has only 83,000 steel workers. This situation wasn't limited to just the steel industry. According to data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the National Association of Manufacturers, there were 413,000 job openings in American construction, and existing manufacturing still had 800,000 unfilled positions. Developing skilled industrial workers doesn't happen overnight, and the glory days of America's steel industry were already in the past. It was destined to face sunset, just like American hegemony.